Good. Okay, let's let's get on with this. So, usual thing, I'm going to slide the chat box across to the left if I can. While I'm doing the chatting, you can type any questions you want to, chat away, and I'll go through these slides, and then we'll come back to some questions afterwards. Okay, this is fairly simple. I've got a little bit of theory background first of all, then take you through the exercise that I use to deal with pretty much everything to do with grief. And then I'm sure you'll have some questions on it, so we'll have a quick chat about that. Okay, so we'll just slide this over here, slide this over here, and then we can hopefully get on with it. Okay, great. Okay, so dealing with grief. Okay, so a little definition of grief. I was nosing around to find some definitions, and this one's quite simple. Webster's Dictionary says is deep sadness caused especially by someone's death. Okay, so this is the common thing of grief. I could probably redefine it ever so slightly, as you see in just a moment, but this is the common idea. Usually, deep sadness when someone's died is the usual thing. Okay? So, obviously, that can be. I've got this little brimming thing down the bottom. Can you get this a second? Bear with me just a moment. It can be typical things: loss of a parent, loss of a child, loss of a partner, loss of any significant relation, really. Grandparents, brother, sister, sibling, whatever. Loss of a good friend, loss of animal, loss of a pet. So I think grief really can come about from any kind of meaningful loss. Okay, any kind of meaningful loss. Something, someone, something is not there anymore. Leaves a big gap, a big hole in some way. And that's what triggers the grief process. Let's just go through some of the thoughts and ideas around grief itself, first of all. Okay, so there's this idea called the 5 stages of grief. Excuse me, the 5 stages of grief. It's laid out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did a lot of work on this. She's quite famous for this. She'd spent a lot of work working with people who are dying and terminal patients and people who are grieving and loss. And she came up with these ideas. There's also a slightly different version called the 7 stages of grief, but I think they're really the same one. They're just slightly expanded, so I kind of merged the two together here. Hopefully it'll still make sense for you. So the 5 typical stages of grief that people may experience are, the first one is kind of shock, disbelief, denial. Second one is anger. Then we have the bargaining or the guilt stage. And the depression stage. And finally the acceptance, sometimes called the acceptance and hope stage. Let's just go through those for a moment to make sure you're clear what they all are. See if you can recognize where a client is if they start talking to you about grief. Okay. So shock, denial, disbelief, this one's fairly straightforward. Okay, the person is in shock and does not want to acknowledge the bad news. Okay, there must be some mistake, is that idea. It can't be true. No, it can't be true. Imagine this kind of idea. They've experienced it ourselves, or seen it firsthand, or seen it in films and movies. It's that typical reaction to some kind of loss. Shock, denial, disbelief. This is kind of supposedly the first stage, right? I say supposedly because there's no evidence to suggest that everybody moves through these stages. These are just different stages people may experience. Okay. Second stage is typically a form of anger. Okay, the person's bottled up emotion then comes out as anger at the situation. It's not fair. Why? Why does it happen? Why? It's not fair. This kind of stuff. Ranting and raging. There's different theories of this. Some people think it's maybe like a defense mechanism, a protective mechanism. It's like the fight or flight kicking in. Some people say it's just easier to be angry than it is to accept what's happened. But this is a common stage that people go through in the second stage of grief. Okay. The third one is called the bargaining stage in the Kubler-Ross model, or guilt sometimes people add into it, first of all, I think they're very similar in a way, you know. It's where people start thinking, if only we'd done this, if only I could do this, okay? Or kind of bargaining, sometimes bargaining with God, or whatever their beliefs are, okay? Please take it back. If I do this, can we make it okay again? Can we go back in time? I feel bad, I regret. If only I'd done this, if only I'd said this, if only that happened, that hadn't happened. You know, this is like a willing, a wishing it could be different. You know, looking for a way out of the situation, trying to find anything just to escape the situation, to make it different in some way. Right? So this is what's meant by the bargaining or the guilt stage. Okay. And then the next stage is often labelled depression. I think it's slightly misleading that, but really what it is, it's where the person starts to acknowledge the inevitable and begins to feel the sadness of the loss. You know, he's gone, she's gone, wherever it is. Suddenly it's like the reality sinks in. And with that, you know, you get the mourning feeling, the emptiness, the sadness, the loneliness, they're not here anymore, something's different, something's changed. Okay, life will never be the same again, that kind of feeling. So I see why it's called depression, because it tends to be a very down feeling. Right. But it's typically that emptiness, sadness, loneliness, or whatever it is that the person goes through. You start to really feel the sense of the loss there. And then after this, when the person's moved through this or overcome this, ideally, finally the person accepts the loss. You know, things may never be the same, but life can go on. It may be different, but life can go on, and there may be some sense of a future, some sense of positive future. Okay, and often people will make a lot of meaning out of the loss. That will be a turning point or a life-changing moment for them, a life-defining moment. Not always, but sometimes it is, and they begin to see things differently, think differently, feel differently, of course. Right? So acceptance and hope obviously is the ideal place to get someone to. Okay, but obviously you can't rush that. If something's happened yesterday, that's very different than if it's happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago. You know? So that's why when we chat the client, as you see in a moment, we've got to just take a look at these things to decide whereabouts they're at and how best we can support them. Okay, so this is the kind of five-ish stages that people may be experiencing. As I said, these stages are not fixed, and people do not necessarily move through each stage. They're just common reactions that people may be going through at any particular time following a loss. Right? So maybe jump from one to the other, or skip a few stages. Really, really depends. Okay. So if we're looking around the idea of treating grief, then this is kind of the way I tend to go about it. Right? So first of all, we've got to establish the details of the loss. You know, how soon, or how recent did it happen? Is it a few months ago? Is it a few years ago? Mm-hmm. Someone who's suffered major loss in the past few weeks or months and is really, really upset and beside themselves, that's kind of understandable. If it's 3 years later, 5 years later, then it's still understandable, but it should have moved on to some degree, ideally by then. Okay, so it shouldn't be so all-consuming. So again, if it's very recent, it's understandable for the person to be in tears all the time. If it's a long ago, then it's an indicator that there's something still holding on to. Obviously there's some losses we never get over, but we should be able to find a way to move on in life still. If we can't, there's something lingering, something hanging in there. So those are the things I tend to look for, little hooks. You know, what is it that's keeping this person stuck? What's stopping the natural grieving process from occurring? Right? So somewhere in the chat, we're looking around for these ideas. Okay. And a way of doing that, one way of finding that out is that, you know, trying to find out, well, what does the loss mean to the client? Obviously, if it's a child, that's a very different thing than if it's an elderly relative. Okay. You know? So find out what does the loss mean to the client? How's it impacting the client's life? Okay. Someone who's lost an elderly parent, that could be sad, but maybe that parent meant a lot to them in more than just a parental sense. You know? What if it's a grandparent who died and the parents had divorced, separated, and the child had actually grown up with the grandparent for the first 10 years of their life. So the grandparent was really like the mother to begin with. You know? So it wasn't really like losing a grandparent, it's like losing a mother. I'm trying to find out these kind of things. One gentleman I helped, going back a couple of years now, a year or so ago, he'd lost his partner of something like 30 years. And that was bad, losing his partner of 30 years, but actually what it did, it took him way back to the teenage years when he was struggling with his identity, struggling with sexuality, struggling with his identity. And when he met someone and they got together for the first time in his life, he felt validated with who he was. This person loved him for who he was. They got together and they lived together and like a happy couple for 30 years. That person dies and suddenly he's back there where he was before, vulnerable, exposed and on his own. So in that situation, we weren't dealing with just with the grief, we were dealing with all the issues that then came back to the surface. So I have to deal with that first of all, as well as the grief. Right? So you've got to find out what the loss means. What does it mean to the client? Is it the only person who's ever been nice to the client, the only person who's ever loved them, the only person who's ever supported them? So suddenly we have all these kind of possibilities going on. So you need to find out what it means to the client, all right? Sometimes it'll be obvious, okay? But a question I always ask is, did they get a chance to say goodbye properly? Okay. I always say to the client, did you get a chance to say goodbye properly? And sometimes they did. Sometimes they said, yeah, I was with them for a week and we said our goodbyes and it was okay. And so that's all right. That's fine in a way. Very often though, it's sudden or the medical situation takes over and the person just doesn't get to say goodbye properly. And from my experience, this is one of the biggest problems with the grieving process, that there never was a proper goodbye process. Okay, so this is what got me into this idea I started using, which I call the magical glade, which we'll come into in just a moment. Right? How to release the held-in feelings that are preventing a natural grieving process from occurring. Okay? How to help that person get past the denial, get past the anger, get past the guilt, get past the depression, and get them move them on to the acceptance and hope. Okay, not denial, not pretending it didn't happen, but just how do we move them past those first 4 stages to get them onto the 5th one, and speed that process up a little. Right. And sometimes it's just a case of common sense as well. I remember a lady came to see me who had lost her fiance, the night before their wedding. He died the night before their wedding. She had a sudden urge to speak to him on the phone, called him up, and he died on the phone while she was speaking to him. And she'd been in a great state of shock from that. And her friends have been saying, yeah, keep crying, let the tears keep coming out, keep it going. And we're about a year and a half later, and I said to her, well, that's okay, yeah, but you still got to live, you still got to move on with life. And she said, so is it okay to stop crying? And I said, yeah, it's okay to stop crying whenever you want. We did the magical glade exercise so she can move on. But for her, it was like, oh, okay, I thought I got to keep dragging myself through these emotions. I said, yeah, it's all right. You can do it for a while, but you don't need to keep doing it. Okay, so that was just simple, common sense advice in a way to her, and that was very liberating for her. Okay. But nearly everybody who has any kind of grief or loss, this is the exercise I go through. So I'm going to take you through this exercise now, which I call the magical glade or the enchanted glade exercise. So it's something like this. I'm going to just read this to you because this is how I would say it to a client. Okay. Let's say, imagine you're walking through beautiful woods on a lovely sunny day. Sunlight filtering through the trees and a gentle breeze rustles the leaves. You notice some woodland creatures scampering here and there and feel the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath your feet. Up ahead you notice what seems to be a clearing in the woods, but when you step into it, it has a magical, enchanted feel to it, as if anything could happen here. As you step further in, you feel safe, but in anticipation of something. And then from the other side of the glade, you see whoever it is walking towards you. He or she looks well and happy. And as you move closer towards each other, you realize this is an opportunity to say all the things you never had a chance to say. Obviously, I tailor it ever so slightly depending on the situation and the person and circumstances from information we gathered when talking. But we're setting the scene there, so in the person's mind, we're in this safe, beautiful, magical place where we can have a conversation. And obviously, by now, quite often, we've got some wobbly chins going on and little tearful eyes already. Okay. But it tends to go in three parts. Okay, so this is the magical glade three-part conversation. This is how I tend to do this. Right? So the first part. So you have the client talk to the deceased person, expressing everything they never had a chance to say, good or bad. Okay, this isn't always lots of lovingness and fluff and niceness. Sometimes there's anger and hurt and resentment and guilt and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so you have to get them to be honest. This only works if you get the client to be really, really honest. And I always tell them that as well. I say, don't just say, the nice things, say what you really, really feel inside. Because very often clients will feel hurt or abandoned. How could you leave me? You were the one person in life that made me feel safe and you left me. That kind of stuff, You abandoned me, you got away with it. All those things you did, I never got a chance to tell you how horrible you were. So sometimes this is a lot of anger and hurt and resentment going on here. So I always encourage the client to be really, really honest. Okay. And again, I just check in with the client, see how they're feeling now and again to make sure that they're doing that. Sometimes it's really obvious, but if they're going quiet, it usually means they're mulling information over in their mind and not saying it out loud. Right? Now the key thing here, again, is when you're doing all these expressing things, is to get the client to say it to the person. If they start saying it to you, like, oh, he was this and she was this, then you say, no, don't tell me, tell them. Tell him, tell her, say it to him, say it to her. Because that will be far more powerful that way. You want the client to be talking directly to the deceased person or persons or beings, whoever it is. Right? And quite often I'll prompt them, based on information they give me in the chat, or if this happens spontaneously during a session, I'll just draw out some information. Things they were saying, So let's say we've had a conversation earlier, and what does this person mean? You made a note of that, you remember it. So you're saying to them, you made me feel so special and loved. You were the one person who protected me when nobody else would. You were the person who supported me when everybody else said I would fail. You gave me the courage to succeed. Whatever it is, these kind of ideas, look for the little hooks that was meaningful between the client and that person, and get them to say those out loud. All these will, there'll be a lot of wobbly chins going on at this moment, and tears and this stuff in most people. Not everybody, in most people. Right? So you really want an outpouring of honesty, authenticity, of love or hate, whatever it is, just to get back to love, but being really, really honest. Okay. And I just keep this going for as long as there's something to say. Okay. Until the client starts to calm down a bit or runs out of steam or there's nothing else to say at the moment. Right? So this is the first part. Okay. And this is pretty good in itself. Okay. But then part two, this is the interesting bit, because now I have the client switch places in their mind and become the deceased person or persons or being talking back to the client. Okay. When I say switch, quite often I say, right, I'm going to count to 3, and I might tap the back of your hand or click my fingers. I'll do kind of 1, 2, 3, click, or 1, 2, 3, tap. Something like that to initiate the switch, to make it a definite switch. And from that moment, I will address the client now as if they are the deceased person. Okay. Encouraging the deceased persons to talk back or say to the client everything the client needs to hear. Right? So let's say we've got a situation where maybe the client's feeling guilty for not doing enough, or not saying enough, or not being there enough before X person died. Now, as the deceased person, look, I might say, look, so-and-so there, your son, your daughter, your brother, whatever, is feeling really bad, feeling really guilty because they weren't there enough at your side. What would you say to them? Talking to the client as if they're a deceased person. And then the client, then, as a deceased person, talks to themselves. I'd say, look, you did what you could. You did the best you could. I know you loved me. I know you would have been there, but you couldn't, and that kind of stuff, right? Or whatever the context of the conversation is. But you have the client as the deceased person talking back to themselves. And quite often use their name. Look at if the client's name is. For some reason, the name Sophie's coming to mind. Okay, so the client's name is Sophie. Say, look at little Sophie there, your daughter Sophie, she's feeling this, she's feeling lost, she's feeling lonely. What can you say to Sophie? Now she's here, now she's listening to you. And get the client to speak in that way. Okay, so really, in my mind, I make it as real as I possibly can. Sometimes the client will jump out, sometimes they'll resist this. By jump out, I mean they'll jump back into being themselves. They don't mean to jump out of the chair, they jump out of the visualization. I'll always say, no, just be the person, be this person, be that person, whatever, okay? And really, again, an outpouring of everything that's need to be said, right? And again, this is often quite emotional as well. Right? And again, at some point, depending on the belief system of the client, and I'll try and get a feel for this as we're talking, I'll get the deceased person to say, look, I'm always here with you. I still love you. I always have. I still do. I always will. I'll always be there with you in the way I can. Just watching over you, helping you, supporting you, something like that. So that a part of the deceased person is still there with you, with the client, okay? As long as that's appropriate, okay? So these are kind of common things I'll say just to move things along a little bit. Right. And keep this going for as long as it feels appropriate. Right. When this starts to run out of steam, then part 3, we switch back again. Okay. So we have the client switch back to being themselves and see how different they feel now. Just checking with the client, hearing those words, how different does that feel? Even though they've been the ones saying it, in the vast majority of people, it will feel as if they've had a conversation and their deceased person or persons or beings have just spoken to them. So checking, how different does that feel now? Most people will say, feel lighter, feel freer, feel like I can move on now. Feel sad, feel empty still, but feel better, feel okay. Right, things like this. Right? Now, if there's more to say, we'll have them say it. For example, hearing the person say that, what do you want to say to them now? So have the client now talk back to the deceased person again. Just see what other thoughts, other insights come to mind. Okay. And most of the time, this 3 parts is enough. Occasionally, you might have to switch back again. Okay, just become the deceased person again. If there's a little contentious point, shall we say, we have to and fro a little bit. Right? Most people, it'll be, themselves, the deceased, back to themselves is usually good enough. So there's more to say, encourage them to say it. But if not, then we just gently begin the kind of the goodbye process. Okay? And all this whole thing could take 5 minutes or it could take 45 minutes. It depends on what there is to say, right? So this is, can be quite short, can be quite long. When the client is running out of things to say, then I'll start looking for ways to exit the glade, to say goodbye to the deceased person or whatever, let them go off, so the client can begin to come back, hopefully feeling different in some way. Okay. So usually I'll ask things like, is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye in just a moment? Okay. But again, I'll always have the client know that they can always come back to this place. In a moment, a few months' time, we've got to say goodbye for now, but you can always return to this place in your mind, and they'll always be here. And quite often you'll see the clients just nodding and smiling and feeling that, yeah, there's a connection there. Right. Sometimes they say, no, it's okay, I can let them go now, they can go. Right. And like a waving goodbye and that kind of thing. Right. As a bit of a tearjerker, I always get them to say, thank you for being my, whatever it is, my mother, my father, son, daughter, grandparent, friend, pet, whatever it is. Thank you for being whatever it was for me, okay? That usually triggers a little pouring of emotion as well. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for being my whatever. Sometimes I do that as well when we're in the role switch. If it's a deceased parent to a child, thank you for being my son, thank you for being my daughter, talking to the client, something like that. Thank you for being my whatever is usually a pretty good phrase that has a bit of a final clear out there. Okay. So then once we've done that, we Ideally, the clearing, the glade is now empty, the deceased person, beings have gone, whatever. I'll explain what I mean by beings in just a moment, why I keep saying that phrase. And then we just reverse the visualization of the client. Know they can come back to this place anytime they choose, but for now, just walk out of the glade, back through the woods, etc. Back up the hill if they came down the hill, just back into the room or whatever it is, okay? And then I'll normally just reinforce some of the things that have been said during the session there. I'd reinforce those as like some positive suggestions as the client comes back there. I'd always kind of check in with how they're thinking, how they're feeling at that moment, okay? I'd rarely ask them to open their eyes straight away, just check in with how they feel, just to make sure they're okay. So what I find is using this very simple but profoundly effective technique, I can address the person at whatever stage of the grief they're at, okay? Wherever they are, whether the shock or disbelief, because they have to face up to things. If it's the anger, they can express the anger and move past that onto the other thing. If it's the what if this, if what if that, they can have a conversation and say, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done that. And get the guilt out, get the regret out. Okay? If it's the sadness, it's the loss, they can express it. I miss you, it's sad without you, it's lonely without you, life's not the same without you, and have the person talk back to them, all that kind of stuff. Right? And whichever level they're at, whichever stage they're at, in most cases it will lead them to the acceptance and the hope or move on stage much more quickly. And that's what we're looking for. Okay, sometimes it goes beautifully, smoothly, really well, exactly as I've described. Sometimes it's like a work of art. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing to witness, taking someone through this. Sometimes there may be a muddle of conflicting emotions to work through. What if the client feels sad at the loss of someone, but also there was anger, hurt, rage as well, and maybe some digging around of that. I loved you, but I hated you. So you have to go through this muddle of emotions sometimes as well. So don't be surprised if that happens sometimes. Right? Sometimes the person can't quite feel, sense, or visualize. So you just do it as best you can. What would it be? What do you think they would say? What do you feel they're saying back to you? If they can't get into the role reversal thing, especially if they had, say, a non-caring, a non-communicative deceased person, that can be tricky. But you just do the best you can, and you put your own input into it. So if someone was not very nice in life, you say, look, now they're in a different place. Now they're realizing the impact of life and what they've been through and how they could do things differently. Now they're in that place, feeling, sensing all the things they could have done differently. I wonder what they'd say to you now. You can't say all probably say sorry, something like that. Okay. So sometimes you've got to be a little creative with this. Most of the time it works absolutely beautifully, but occasionally just be aware that you have to be on your toes a little bit. Okay. But the trick is, whatever is going on, just engage the conversation, expressing the unexpressed, and allow every emotion to be valid. Okay, every emotion. We're not looking, as I said, we're not looking for just the nice ones here. Authentic, honesty, being really honest. Every emotion will get the best effect from this. Okay. And again, as I said earlier, just be prepared to switch back and forth a few times if need be. Quick summary, I've used this method in a multitude of scenarios, including loss of babies at birth, miscarriages, and abortions. Okay? How many people feel guilt and regret over miscarriage or stillborn baby or abortion, abortion where it's deliberate, And then sometime later they feel regret and guilt. So I found this to be a really, really useful way of just redressing that, okay? But rather than sometimes having a person or being there, they may say like the personality essence of the being, or the essence of the being, or the ball of light, whatever it is, these kind of phrases. It's that's in the magical glade, If someone's had an abortion, for example, and feels guilty about it some years later, say, look, you step into this glade, and from the other side is that little being of light, little light essence of the person that could have been there, just coming to meet you, so you can have a conversation. And again, just switch places and do the same thing again. And the little personality essence says, it's okay, it wasn't my time, it wasn't meant to be, it's okay, no problem, I forgive you, all that kind of stuff. That's what we're looking for. Right? Sometimes you have to help and encourage it. Most of the time it happens naturally. Right? So I'm sure you can imagine the kind of the healing benefit of this idea. Right? And I've seen lots of visualizations before of, enveloping people in a white light of forgiveness and stuff. All that's all right, but my own personal experience is just say the stuff that's difficult to say, get that said out loud, and that will create way, way more healing, right? Way more healing. Purge the emotion, purge the thoughts, get it expressed, get it said, and then the forgiveness and all that stuff comes quite naturally afterwards. Okay. So this is why I've been saying the deceased person or beings or pets as well. I've done this with various pets. Very recently actually with pets, loss of pets. So it's whatever the loss is. Okay, best friend as well. I remember doing one with the best friend. Two guys just grew up together, had life together. They would just live life together. And when one died, quite young, early 30s, it was just such a person thought, it's just like I've lost half myself's gone. So it was best friend. So you can apply this to any kind of loss. Okay. As always, take the idea, the principles, experiment with it. The results are often miraculous. Okay, I'm not exaggerating there, but sometimes you have to be a little creative in there. Good. Okay, let's go through some questions. Any practical questions you might have? I've got to find a way out of this screen for a moment. See if you make sure you're still there, so we can have a little chat. Good. Okay, great. So let's have a look. Right. So just give you these. Hi. Everyone, yeah, la. That's good. So hi everyone. Hi Nelly. Cool. Sound distorted. John. John, yeah. Hi Sophia. I just felt I need to give my dog a hug. Yeah, that's all right. Good. Lost the job, etc. I think so. Yeah, it's any sense of loss, really. Because losing the job is a big identity thing for some people, and actually there's a guy I've been helping very recently who's been through that exact thing, and it seemed to me the loss of his job had a bigger impact than the loss of his some family members that occurred at the same time. Right? So yeah, especially people have a lot invested in that. So totally, I think so too. Yeah. And it says, what happens if the deceased says something less than nice? Yeah, so this is the bit where I say it's not always. Sometimes it's beautiful and miraculous. Sometimes it gets a little tricky. Okay, so this is where you have to just be aware of this. Okay, so because sometimes the deceased don't always say nice things. Right? The vast majority of the time they do, but occasionally you're going to come up against someone where the deceased person was not that nice. Right? So that's where, rather than letting the whole process flow quite naturally, sometimes in those situations, if I feel that's happening, I kind of jump in a little bit and I will manipulate the situation slightly more, shall we say. But we have to make sure that the client still feels validated. Right? So it's the same as it would if we're doing like a regression visualization, expressing the expressed to someone who's not nice in childhood. It's the same kind of thing, really. You've got to, try and get the feelings across to that person. Okay. That the client's feeling, the feelings the client's experiencing. If the deceased person says something that's the client says, well, yeah, it's true, I am lazy, I don't do anything at all, then I just might, engage in a conversation of what would be a useful thing to come from it. What is it you both need to hear? What is it you need to hear? What is it you need to say? What do you need to feel? Something like this. I'd just be fishing around, yeah. Okay. Jones, there's a bit of a throwback to a previous webinar, but sometimes I find a loss of a belief. Letting go of an idea can cause that as well. Yeah, that's true. Kim says, what if the client resists being deceased? Yeah, sometimes they do, but I can be quite persistent at times. So I tend to say just go with it for now. Just pretend, just for now. Okay, just if they really resist, I say just humour me, just for a moment, just to see what it's like, just for a moment. Okay. So I'll always encourage them to do so. If they really, 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 really don't want to do it, then I'll give up. But that's so rare, because once I've started something, I want to continue it. Okay. So I do try and keep that going if we can. Okay. Emma says, can it be too soon to help? Sometimes I think, but I mean, if let's say there's a tragedy happens or something happens yesterday and the client comes to see you today, then I would still take the person through this process, but knowing that they've still got a lot of grieving to do, because it's just realised the person's not there, and it's a bloody great big hole in life, when people are missing. I've been through this myself. Those of you who know me, I've chatted to you. By the time I was 25, I'd had to organise 4 funerals, so 4 funerals and a wedding. So there's a film in there somewhere. So grief was something I had to learn about very, very quickly at quite a young age, from age 21 to 25. It takes a while. There's a big gap, a big hole in your life when this happens. So you can't expect to get over it very, very quickly. So I don't think it can be too soon to help, because it'll always encourage the process. But I think you can't always expect people to wake up and think, oh, that's fine now, everything's okay. Yeah, if it's very, very soon. Does that make sense, Emma? And Kim, hopefully that answers your both your questions there. And Ant, was that a reasonable enough answer if someone's not nice at all? Yeah. Okay. I can't give you a clear answer what to do, but you usually have to just negotiate a bit and feel around as to why the person's coming across that way and what you can do about it. Vast majority of the time, it's okay. If I suspected that the deceased person may not say something too nice, I might just, do it in a slightly different way. I may not do the switch in that place. Okay. If I knew it wasn't going to be good, I'd probably avoid the switch. I'd just have the client saying it to the person. If I thought it was redeemable, then I'd probably have a go. Hopefully that helps a bit, Ant, as well. Okay, on the idea though, you get the general principle of it. Okay, aborted fetus reflecting guilt of a client. Okay. I've never found that, actually. Okay. I've usually found that if you set the scene right and you create, what you don't want is the idea, sorry if this is applicable to anybody, but what you don't want is the idea of a dead fetus in the glade. Okay, that's not a nice image. All right. What you want is the nice image of like a glowing ball of light, essence, love, being, something like this, something loving, something okay. That's why I say the deceased person, or the being that could have been there, is coming towards you, glowing, filled with love, happy, good, well, that kind of stuff, right? So it's a positive thing you created in the first place. So I would always set it up in that way. And usually, because you're getting the client to speak first of all that guilt tends to come out. Right? They're saying it to the being, the essence there, the fetus essence, whatever. I feel guilty, I feel bad, I feel like I did this, I wish I hadn't done this. All that's coming out, so they're pouring all the guilt out first of all. Right? And then switch around. No, I'd never tell the client not to feel guilty. Okay. I always want the client to tell themselves that. So many people have probably already told that client not to feel guilty, but until they can tell themselves not to feel guilty, it's not going to make a difference. Right? So I may sneak my voice in there in the shape, form of the being in the glade, shall we say, but I want the client to tell themselves not to feel guilty. As the being, as the light being, as the essence there, let's say the aborted fetus essence light being, I want the client, when they switch roles, to tell themselves not to feel guilty. Does that make sense, Carol? That would be way, way more effective than me just saying don't feel guilty. Okay. Once we've been through this, I'll remind them of that later on, okay? But I want that initial idea to come from the client. Does that make sense, lovely? Because then it'll be an inner shift. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, well done. Great. All these things to act like a negotiator to try and draw out what you know the client needs to hear, but you want to hear them say it to themselves. This is the beauty of this method, this technique when it works well, is because the client has a really in-depth emotional conversation with themselves and heals themselves, and you just kind of set the scene for them, really. Does that make more answer your question, Ant, on the thing there? Any other questions on this? It's the only thing I've got to say on grief, really, because this is kind of what I do with everybody. I just do this and work around it and see what happens. If there's side issues, then I'll shoot off and deal with that, like the guy I told you about, who's whose partner had died. Then we had to nip off and deal with that for a bit. Over a couple of sessions, we did that. So side issues will come up, but usually this is what I do actually. And a guy recently I remember who helped to. His daughter had died 3 years ago, I think it was. And the family had really fallen apart. His son had gone into depression. The mum was barely speaking. The father was just drinking himself and stuff. I think I mentioned him in the alcohol webinar I did, actually. And I just said to him, look, did you get a chance to say goodbye? And he just welled up with tears and said no. And I thought, okay, that's it, and we'll do this. And this is all I did with him. It really, really, really set him free. And then he was set free, and then he could go back home and start to rebuild things with his son and his wife and get the family back together again. So, good, Emma. So, would you do the side issues first and the guild after? It depends how they came up, really, Emma. Yeah, it depends how it all came up. Excuse me. So, if the guilt came up first, to get them just expressing it, and then if there was a reason why they felt so much guilt, I might just dip into that. If there was a past experience, take them through that, go through that for a moment, come back to the scene in the glade, maybe. If I start off with the scene in the glade, I'll always finish there. But if when we're chatting, first of all, and I realise there's stuff coming up, I'll go and do that first of all before I do the scene in the glade thing, if that makes sense. Right, so the guy, the guy lost his partner. I think once he told me that, I spent some time doing that first of all before I did the goodbye thing. Hopefully that answers the question. Oh, sorry, grief after. Okay. Side issues first and the grief after. Yeah, I think I just answered that, didn't I? So, yeah, the order in which they come up is what I try and deal with it. Okay. Good. Any other questions? Anybody else? Hopefully that's nice and simple and straightforward. I know it seems weird asking someone to switch places and become a dead person or dead being and talk back to themselves, but it's profoundly effective in most people. Okay, so just have the courage to do it. Typically I'll say 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to tap the back of your hand, and when I tap the back of your hand, 1, 2, 3, you're now switching places. You are becoming blah blah blah, whatever, and then same thing back again. Right? So it can be that simple, or it can be, like I said earlier, click of the fingers. 1, 2, 3. And now I'm saying something. Right. Good. If everyone's okay, we can leave it there. I'll finish early for once, which is great. Any other questions, anybody? Thanks, Joss. Lovely. Cool. Yeah, welcome. Welcome, Kim. All right, everybody. I'll leave it there for now. Anything else? You're welcome. Thanks, everybody. Carol, sorry, what you do as a pet? Exactly the same thing, okay? I did this week, I did this with someone saying goodbye to 2 dogs. Exactly the same thing. No different, but the dogs could speak, okay? They could communicate an idea, all right? Exactly the same thing. All right, lovely. Any other final questions? Okay, what I'll do, I'll leave it there, and any other questions, obviously pop them in the Facebook area, we can chat there. And I'll see you all soon. Have a good evening, everyone, and see you next time we catch up. Cheers, thanks for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it. Talk soon.